Hi, welcome to Get Lit at the Walnut Creek Public Library. My name is Pete Crooks. I'm senior editor and senior writer at Diablo Magazine. And on Get Lit, we speak with East Bay authors about their books, about publishing, and about how they use libraries in their lives and in their work. Today we have a very special guest, author Jack Cheevers, whose new book, Act of War, is just a fascinating account of a true situation with a U.S. spy ship off the coast of North Korea in the late 1960s. Jack, welcome to Get Lit.
Thanks very much for having me, Pete.
Well, this is just an absolutely astonishing piece of work, obviously very densely reported, and one of those true stories that is just astonishing to read it. It's like something out of a Tom Clancy spy novel, or you know, one of those really great reads, and even more astonishing that it's all true. How did you come to explore this story? What were the origins?
Well, I'm a native New Englander, and I think sea stories are genetically imprinted in our beings. And I was, at the time, I was looking for something to write a book about, and I actually came across a memoir that had been written by the captain of the Pueblo, which was published in 1970. And I saw it in a coffee house I used to go to in LA on the weekends, and I paid $1 for it. I picked it up, I took it home, and I started reading. I just couldn't put it down. It was just really a fascinating story. And I realized that I looked him up, and it turned out that he was living in San Diego at the time. So I cold called him, and I said, hi, I'd like to come down and talk to you and explore the idea of writing a book. And it was a little cool at first, but he eventually warmed up, and I started going down there and interviewing him. And we'd spend the entire day together, and we'd talk for 6 or 8 hours, and then I'd take him and his wife out for dinner, and we'd continue talking into the evening. And that's basically how the project started. He opened some doors for me with other members of the crew, and that's how it got rolling.
So I love that moment of inspiration that you're having coffee, and it's obviously a used paperback, right? His autobiographical take on this story. And it was his book about his entire life, or was it mostly the experiences with the Pueblo?
It was about his whole life, including his experiences on the Pueblo and afterwards too. And he was a very interesting man. He was a career Navy officer. Mm-hmm. He had been born during the Depression in Idaho into very difficult circumstances. He was an orphan. Later wound up at Boys Town in Nebraska for most of his teenage years. Then he went into the Navy as an enlisted man, eventually became an officer. He had been trained as a submarine officer and served on 3 different subs in the 50s and 60s that were engaged in spy missions primarily against the Soviet Union in the Far East. His dream was to command a submarine, but of course the Navy what they call surfaced him. They brought him out of the submarine corps, and they gave him a surface ship, which turned out to be the Pueblo. His book recounts all of those details, and then goes into his experiences in prison in North Korea, the Navy court of inquiry that took place when the crew came home, and then a little bit about his life after that.
And what's his name? And it sounds like you were immediately taken by his autobiography, but sometimes I think that can, and I certainly think in the case of your book, an autobiographical account can serve as terrific source material, but it really takes an outside journalist to aggregate the entire story, because he's obviously seeing it through his very personal and traumatic experiences, which are extremely dramatic. But we'll get into your research on the book and telling the larger story of the Pueblo. His name is?
His name is Lloyd Bucher, but everybody knew him by his nickname Pete.
Pete Bucher, and he passed away.
Yes, he did about 10 years ago.
And so when did you meet him, and how much time did you spend with him over the years?
I met him in 2000, right as I was starting to do my research, and I drove down to his house probably a half a dozen times over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, and like I said, I spent the entire day with him. And after that, I would be on the phone with him every once in a while. I went down there one time with a photographer to take pictures of him and his wife, and he actually invited me to a reunion of the crew. Wow. That took place in Missouri in 2003, so I got to meet other members of the crew as well.
Mm-hmm. It's the late 1960s, 1968 is the incident?
Yes.
Okay, so we're several years after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is a top secret mission, obviously, and North Koreans aren't supposed to know that there's this small spy ship hovering off their coast. What was the assignment? What were they trying to get?
Well, their assignment was to collect data on radar and radio stations that the North Korean military was operating along the east coast of North Korea. And the idea was to pinpoint the locations of those stations so that in the event of war between the United States and North Korea, American warships and aircraft could home in on those stations and take them out early in the war. And the ship was trying to detect the precise location of the stations as well as measure the shape and size of the radar signal, and that would also be useful information in terms of trying to jam those stations in the event of war too.
And that boat that he is commanding has like all the latest spy gadgetry and surveillance gadgetry, but almost no firepower.
Right.
Correct? So
exactly.
They're then intercepted by a Korean warship.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was actually an old Army freighter that had been very hurriedly converted into an eavesdropping platform that the Navy was going to use, and it was a very small ship. It was only 176 feet long. There are some ocean-going Navy tugs that are bigger than that ship. And originally it was unarmed, and the theory was that we don't want to provoke the North Koreans or, for that matter, the Chinese or Soviets. The ship was theoretically going to do eavesdropping on all three of those countries. But at the last minute, the Navy installed two 50 caliber machine guns, and there were a handful of small arms. There was some Thompson submachine guns, some rifles, some .45 pistols for the crew to use, some grenades to use against enemy swimmers. But it was very lightly armed. It was a very small ship, and it was never intended for any kind of pitched combat at sea. And as you mentioned, it was literally stuffed to the gunnels with classified eavesdropping equipment, code machines, dozens and dozens and dozens of very highly classified documents, operating and repair manuals for the code machines, all kinds of classified intelligence reports about eavesdropping that the United States was doing on communist military forces all over Southeast Asia and the Far East. And there was no means to destroy that equipment quickly. The crew the only thing they had to work with were fire axes and sledgehammers. They had a very small incinerator, but you would have to break up these manuals and feed them almost page by page into the incinerator. And they had some weighted canvas bags to put the paper in and throw it over the side. But none of those things worked very well when they were attacked. And what happened was they were about 15 miles off the port of Wonsan in North Korea. This was January 23rd, 1968, and today happens to be the 46th anniversary of that day. And the North Koreans had been tracking them as they patrolled the coast, and they knew they were there. And they'd left them alone for several days, but on this particular day they came out with a flotilla of gunboats. There were 4 torpedo boats. There were 2 North Korean subchasers that were pretty heavily armed. The subchasers had cannon. The torpedo boats obviously had torpedoes and machine guns. The Pueblo was absolutely no match for that kind of gunboat, especially 6 of them. There were 2 MiG fighters overhead firing missiles. The PT boats can travel up to 50 knots. The Pueblo's top speed was 13 knots. Wow. So there was no way that the Pueblo could outrun these ships either. So it was basically trapped and heavily outgunned.
And they came in firing, right? They were.
Yeah, they opened fire. They originally signaled the Pueblo to heave to, in other words, to stop. But the Pueblo was already stopped dead in the water, and the captain was very confused by that. And then one of the torpedo boats started to back toward the Pueblo with a boarding party, an armed boarding party. And Captain Bucher at that point decided that he couldn't fight them, so his best opportunity was to run. So he hit full speed ahead, his full 13 knots, and they tried to escape. And at that point, the North Koreans opened fire on them. So they were frantically trying to bash the code machines with these fire axes and sledgehammers, set fire to to the classified material in waste paper baskets, dump as much of the stuff over the side as they could, but the North Koreans were blasting them with cannons and machine guns. It was difficult to, it was very dangerous to take this stuff out to the exposed outer decks. So they're trying to destroy it internally as much as possible while running, and the captain was trying to buy time, as much time as possible. But eventually he felt that the North Koreans were just going to cut him to pieces, and he stopped the ship. One of his men was fatally wounded. He'd been hit in the groin by a cannon shell, which basically, all but sheared off his right leg. His guts were literally spread all over the deck. There were 10 other sailors who were wounded, some of them pretty badly.
How many on the ship?
There were 83 sailors. That was the original crew. And the captain made the decision at that point to stop the ship and see what would happen. He eventually, the North Koreans started to, they ordered him to follow them into Wonsan, and he, moved very slowly. He was only traveling 3 or 4 knots, and again trying to buy time to destroy the equipment. And he stopped a second time. They again blasted him with cannon fire and machine gun fire, and that prodded him to keep going. And the men did their best to destroy the classified materials, but it turned out that they just didn't have enough time. It would have taken them probably 18 to 20 hours to get rid of the stuff with the tools they had at hand, and they just didn't have that kind of time.
So what happened to the ship?
Well, the ship was captured. The ship was boarded by the North Koreans. They beat the living daylights out of the captain to try and subdue him and make him compliant. They were firing AK-47 rifles over the crewmen to make them subdued and compliant. They blindfolded them. They tied their hands behind their backs. They had them seated on the deck, the fore and aft in the ship, the entire crew. This was, January, and the Sea of Japan was very, very cold. They brought in their own pilot who steered the ship into Wonsan, and then they took the men off at that point, continued to beat them the whole way, and put them on a train into Pyongyang, transferred them to buses, and then put them into a prison where they started to inflict really horrendous torture, particularly on the captain at first. They wanted to break him down quickly. But eventually they beat and tortured the entire crew, starved them for over a period of 11 months until they were finally freed. Wow.
So was the ship stripped for parts, and were all those devices then seized and used in counter spy operations?
Well, that's an interesting question, exactly what use the North Koreans and the Soviets made of all that equipment.
They still have it, I imagine. It was never returned.
Right, it was never returned. In fact, the ship is still in North Korea. The men came home, as I mentioned, 11 months later, actually on Christmas Eve. They arrived in San Diego in 1968 to the incredible joy of their families. But a lot of the equipment, a lot of classified paper on the ship, it turns out they weren't able to destroy, and it's believed to have fallen into the hands of the communists. Wow. And very valuable. There were several different types of code machines. There were these kind of old IBM style punch cards that were used to program the code machines on a daily basis. They captured a bunch of that stuff. They captured a lot of stuff, and the question is, what use did they make of it? Did they ever use that against the United States? And it's still not clear.
Interesting.
What they did. The National Security Agency did an assessment about a year later and concluded that the communists had gained no battlefield advantage over the United States in Vietnam. The communists had not tightened up their communication security at that point, but that was 1969, and we don't know what happened after that. That was the last time anybody tried, to my knowledge anyways, tried to do that kind of assessment. In the meantime, there was a spy ring that was operating, led by a Navy radio specialist named John Anthony Walker Jr. And it turned out that he had walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington just a couple of months, in fact, maybe a couple of weeks before the Pueblo was captured. He walked into the Soviet embassy in DC and offered to sell Navy codes to the Soviets, and obviously they quickly accepted his offer. John Walker later recruited his best friend in the Navy, who was a warrant officer, his son, who was a communications specialist on aircraft carriers, his brother, who was a retired Navy officer, and they were all stealing all kinds of military secrets from the Navy and feeding them to the Soviets. And believe it or not, they stayed in business for 18 years until Walker's ex-wife finally called the FBI and dropped a dime on him in 1985. The FBI finally rolled up the ring. So much material was pouring into Moscow that they actually built a special building and staffed it with people to try and analyze the material that John Walker was supplying. They made him an honorary admiral in their Navy. At one point, a Soviet defector told his US debriefers that we decrypted, based on what you gave us, we cracked all your military codes, and we read 1 million American military messages that we thought were secret up to 1985. He said, had there been a war between the United States and the Soviet Union, we would have won it because we knew everything you were doing, everything your military was doing.
Wow.
That was a defector, take it with a grain of salt,
Sure.
but that's what he told us. I actually talked to a gentleman by the name of Oleg Kalugin. He's a former KGB general who was actually worked out of the Soviet embassy in Washington and was John Walker's handler when he first started working for the Soviets. And I said, General Kalugin, what use did you guys make of the material from the Pueblo? And he said, I don't really know. And I found that answer astonishing. And my theory is that the Soviets may not have even needed the material they got from the Pueblo because they were getting so much from the Walker ring. He was photographing operating manuals and maintenance manuals for encryption systems. He was giving them codes. He was giving them all the material they potentially got from the Pueblo. So it's not clear to me, certainly, what, if any, use the Soviets made of the Pueblo material, how they synthesized it, or if they synthesized it with the material they got from Walker.
Interesting.
And that's still kind of an open question to this day.
What was Walker's motivation?
Greed.
He was
a
getting paid.
greedy trader.
Right. Did you ever read Robert Lindsay's book, Falcon and the Snowman?
Yes,
That's one of my favorite books, as far as these suburban kids who just saw an opportunity to make some money, and they had their issues or whatever, and they got in way too deep with Russian spying.
Right.
So what's really amazing about this book is you are in a coffee shop one day and you think, oh, this sounds interesting, and then you're on a journey for 15 years putting this book together. It came out in December of 2013, 13 years. So can you talk a bit about the reporting? You have this great source, this primary source who lived through this experience, but there's so much more, including declassified Freedom of Information documents and requests for information from the government. So can you walk us through a bit about your reporting journey?
Right. Well, it's just like you mentioned earlier that Bucher's memoir gave me a lot of fascinating information, but it was written from his point of view. It's a very limited, personal point of view. And there were a lot of other dimensions to the story. I was interested in looking at the Pueblo as a global story, not just the Cruz experience, but the experience of the Lyndon Johnson administration in trying to deal with the capture of one of these spy ships. I mean, if you're president of the United States in a communist country, shoots up one of your spy ships that's operating in peacetime in international waters, you're facing all these calls from Congress saying, we've got to go into North Korea, we've got to, retaliate, as a Southern congressman actually said at the time. How do you handle that? And at the time, Johnson had his hands full with the Vietnam War. This is January 1968. The Tet Offensive was just a few days away from after the Pueblo capture. 1968, for anybody who lived through it, was an incredibly tumultuous year in American history. You had Bobby Kennedy being murdered, you had Martin Luther King being assassinated, you had rioting at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, you had the Soviet Union invading Czechoslovakia, you had the Apollo 8 moon orbit. It was just an amazing year, but it was really dominated by the Vietnam War. And the last thing Johnson and his people in the White House and his administration wanted was a second war in Asia. So they made a decision very quickly to try and negotiate their way out of the Pueblo situation, even though, as my title implies and says, it was an act of war under international law. They decided we're not going to use military force to get the ship back. That would probably result in the execution of the crew. We're going to try and get them back alive through negotiation. And that turned out to be a very difficult process because the North Koreans are not easy to deal with. And they had a set of demands that they stuck to unwaveringly for the next 11 months. The same time, tensions were at a complete flashpoint in Korea, because just 2 days before the Pueblo was captured, the North Koreans astonishingly sent a team of commandos, 31 highly trained young men, through the demilitarized zone into South Korea. Their mission was to assassinate the president of South Korea, to break into the Blue House, which is the South Korean presidential mansion. Their orders specifically were to decapitate President Park, to murder his entire family, to murder his staff, to steal trucks and cars and whatever they could get their hands on in the motor pool, and blast their way back to North Korea. That was their mission. They were disguised as South Korean soldiers. They actually wound up getting to within 1,000 yards of the Blue House on a Sunday night. About 10 p.m., they're literally marching down the street in Seoul when they're finally challenged by a suspicious Seoul cop. And he says, "Who are you guys again?" And they said, we're soldiers. We're coming back from an anti-guerrilla mission in the mountains." And they just basically blew past him and kept marching toward the Blue House. And he was not satisfied with that explanation. He called the superior, who came hurrying out to the scene in a Jeep, and he challenged the commandos too, and they finally lost it. And they killed that guy and started throwing hand grenades, shooting at everybody, and literally scattering in all directions in the middle of Sunday night in Seoul. And the South Korean Army, South Korean Combat Police, United States troops spent several days hunting down these guys one by one, and captured all but 2 of them. One of them was put before a sensational press conference where he explained all this, what their target had been and everything, and how close they came to succeeding. This created an uproar in South Korea, as you can imagine. People were very fearful that war would break out at any moment. The president of South Korea, who's an ex-general himself, not somebody to be toyed with. He had taken power in a coup. His impulse was to march north, to retaliate, if not invade North Korea. He was drinking heavily. He was very angry. He was very upset. He was throwing ashtrays at his wife and his staff. He was terrified that had the commandos got inside the Blue House, they would have killed his beloved only son. He was sleeping with a loaded carbine in his bedroom. He was really on the edge. One of our diplomats in Seoul described the environment, the atmosphere at the Blue House, as the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. So Lyndon Johnson also had to manage this, not just the Pueblo and North Korea, but trying to keep a leash on the president of South Korea and restrain him from marching north and starting a war on his own. And at the time, we had something like 50,000 U.S. soldiers stationed along the demilitarized zone. So had a war broken out, we would have immediately been sucked into it. And he was trying to manage that situation too.
Goodness gracious. The situation in North Korea too we're 50 years later, and I think about a month ago I read a story that there was a political assassination or execution in North Korea where somebody was fed to dogs. It's just unbelievable. It's like out of a James Bond movie or something. That level of villainy is going on in our world.
Yeah.
One of the most amazing interview requests I've come across in recent times was that you reached out to Kim Jong-il for comment and thought there was a chance for a while.
Right. Kim Jong-il was at the time the leader of North Korea. Excuse me. He was the son of the leader at the time of the Pueblo in 1968. And I would love to have been able to go to North Korea and interview him or anybody in his regime who knew what had happened, because the big question that remains an open question is why exactly they did it. Why did they take the spy ship, I mean, they ran a huge risk in assaulting a commissioned ship of the United States Navy on the high seas in peacetime, knowing that they could be subject to massive retaliation. And the Pentagon actually assembled a whole series of military options, which included nuclear attack on the north, a massive airstrike designed to take out the entire North Korean Air Force on the ground, naval blockade of all their ports. I mean, there was a very serious matter, and they knew it. They knew that, you know, retaliation could come, but they still took that gamble, which I find very interesting. And I would love to have been able to talk to them about what their calculus was. Why did they think they could get away with it? Because for all they knew, we would have sent aircraft in immediately to start attacking them.
Vaporize them.
Yeah, and that did. I mean, there was a plan for that, which was canceled at the last minute because it was considered too risky, and the president had decided not to go the military route. But anyways, I did actually send a letter to Kim Jong-il. It was addressed to Dear Leader. I sent it to the Central Post Office in Pyongyang. I went out to my local post office in LA, and I said, do you guys have delivery in North Korea? They said, of course, that'll be 92 cents for the stamp. So off went the letter, and a couple of weeks went by, and I got an email from a gentleman who was a member of the North Korean delegation to the United Nations in New York. And he said, Dear Mr. Cheevers, our dear leader has received your letter. We're very interested in your project. Tell us more about yourself. Tell us more about the book. And so we were emailing back and forth. This was in 2002. And at one point he said, you know, every once in a while I fly through Los Angeles on my way home. Maybe we can meet. And I said, that'd be great. You know, we'll have dinner in Koreatown here. You'll enjoy that. And unfortunately, that was the time when the George Bush administration announced that they had discovered that the North Koreans had resumed enriching uranium for nuclear weapons. So that provoked a big diplomatic crisis between us and North Korea. And the curtains just slammed shut on me and my email traffic with this gentleman in New York. I never was able to get in touch with him.
Well, I'll bet you somebody's still reading your email, though, on this side of the fence. So in 1968, the U.S. is involved in a very controversial and unpopular war in Vietnam. The families of these hostages, of these imprisoned crew members of the Pueblo, did they have any idea where were they informed at all about what was going on with their family?
They were frantic. I mean, they knew that the men had been taken captive by North Korea, and the men were forced to write propaganda letters home on kind of a routine basis. And the letters were more and more ominous. And at one point, the sailors were writing things like, to their families, please get in touch with your local senator, please get in touch with the local congressman, and beg the United States government to give the North Koreans what they want, which is a formal apology. You know, the North Koreans insisted that the Pueblo was in their territorial waters, which not the case. They insisted that the Pueblo sailors were guilty of espionage. That's not the case. They were uniformed servicemen conducting a military mission, a legal military mission during peacetime. But the North Koreans wanted what they wanted, and they were using the crewmen as leverage to get it. And this was scaring the daylights out of the families to get, as you can imagine, to get a letter like this. And the other thing that aggravated the situation for the families was that they didn't know what the government was doing. Lyndon Johnson's people were negotiating secretly with the North Koreans to get the men back. It was very frustrating. It took months and months and months. But they eventually figured out the key to get them back. But the families didn't know that at the time. So they were very angry at the government because as far as they could see, the government was doing nothing. And they were giving interviews on radio and television. Pete Booker's wife was a leader. I mean, she basically conducted a one-woman crusade throughout much of 1968, berating Johnson, berating the Navy and the State Department for not doing enough to get the men home, when in fact they were doing all they could, but she didn't know that.
Interesting, fascinating, and congratulations on Herculean effort of reporting this story and seeing it materialize into such a terrific book.
Well, thank
after more than a decade of work.
Thank you.
I think that this is a great Father's Day gift, or especially anybody fascinated by war history and covert operations. This is a really fascinating and terrific piece of work. Jack, thank you so much for coming out to the Walnut Creek Public Library for this interview, and thank you at home for watching Get Lit. Terrific interview with Jack Cheevers today. Make sure you check out his book, Act of War, and keep tuning in to Get Lit, where we talk with local authors about their writing process and about their experience with public libraries. Thanks for watching.